There are people right now who would give anything to feel sad. Not because they're masochists, but because sadness would mean they're feeling something. Instead, they exist in a state of emotional flatness, a psychological gray zone where nothing touches them, nothing moves them, nothing reaches the core of who they are. They're not depressed in the way most people understand depression. They're not crying or suffering. They're just empty. And if you think emotional numbness is preferable to pain, the neuroscience behind this phenomenon reveals something terrifying. The brain shutting down emotions to protect itself can become a prison worse than the pain it was designed to prevent. Let me start with research that distinguishes emotional numbness from typical depression. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Affective Disorders examined what researchers call anhedonia without dysphoria, essentially the inability to feel pleasure or emotional intensity without necessarily feeling sad. They recruited participants who reported emotional flatness and compared their brain activity to those with major depression and healthy controls. The results revealed distinct neural signatures. While typical depression showed hyperactivity in regions processing negative emotion like the amygdala and subgenual cingulate, emotionally numb individuals showed widespread hypoactivity across emotional processing networks. Their ventral striatum, involved in reward and pleasure, showed reduced activity. Their insula, processing visceral emotional experiences, was dampened. Their amygdala, typically hyperactive in depression, was actually underactive. It wasn't that their brain was processing too much negative emotion. It was that their brain had essentially turned down the volume on all emotional processing. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what emotional numbness actually is neurologically. Emotions aren't just psychological experiences. They're coordinated responses involving the brain, nervous system, and body. When you experience an emotion, your limbic system generates the emotional response. Your autonomic nervous system creates physical sensations. Your prefrontal cortex interprets and regulates the experience. And neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine modulate the intensity and quality. Emotional numbness occurs when one or more of these systems becomes dysregulated. Most commonly, it involves what neuroscientists call affective blunting, where the intensity of emotional experience is reduced across the board. A 2020 study published in Biological Psychiatry used experience sampling to track emotional intensity throughout days. Emotionally numb individuals showed dramatically reduced emotional variability. Their emotional range existed in a narrow band, never reaching peaks of joy or valleys of despair, just a flat line of mild neutrality. Now let's talk about how emotional numbness develops, because it's rarely random. Research published in 2018 in the Journal of Traumatic Stress identified trauma, particularly chronic or complex trauma, as the primary risk factor for emotional numbing. When the emotional system is overwhelmed repeatedly, when pain becomes too intense or too frequent, the brain makes a calculation. Feeling is more dangerous than not feeling. Emotional numbness becomes a neural defense mechanism. The researchers examined combat veterans, childhood abuse survivors, and individuals with prolonged exposure to traumatic stress. Across all groups, they found similar patterns. Initially heightened emotional reactivity as the trauma was occurring, followed by gradual dampening of emotional responses. Brain imaging showed reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and limbic structures. The communication pathways that allow emotional experiences to reach consciousness were essentially being pruned away. This process is called dissociation, and while most people associate dissociation with feeling disconnected from reality, emotional numbing is a specific subtype called emotional dissociation. A 2021 study in Development and Psychopathology tracked children exposed to early life stress through adolescence and into adulthood. Those who developed emotional numbness showed measurable changes in brain structure, reduced gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, regions crucial for emotional awareness and integration. What's particularly dark about these findings is that the changes began during developmental periods when the brain is most plastic. The child's brain, repeatedly exposed to overwhelming emotion with no adequate support or regulation, essentially learns to protect itself by reducing its capacity to feel. By adulthood, emotional numbness isn't a choice or a mood. It's become hardwired into the neural architecture. Let's examine the neurotransmitter dysfunction underlying emotional numbness. A 2020 study published in Molecular Psychiatry measured neurotransmitter levels and receptor densities in emotionally numb individuals using advanced PET imaging. They found significant abnormalities in multiple systems. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with motivation and pleasure, showed reduced receptor availability in the ventral striatum. This means even when dopamine was released, there weren't enough receptors to respond to it adequately. Serotonin, involved in mood regulation and emotional processing, showed altered transporter function. The brain was either producing less serotonin or recycling it too quickly, reducing its availability. Endogenous opioids, the brain's natural pain and pleasure chemicals, showed blunted release in response to typically rewarding stimuli. The neurochemical systems that create emotional experiences were fundamentally disrupted. The brain's capacity to generate feeling had been biochemically compromised. Research on the specific quality of emotional numbness provides important insights. A 2019 study in emotion had emotionally numb participants describe their internal experience in detail. The descriptions were strikingly consistent, like watching life through glass, existing but not living, going through the motions, knowing I should feel something but can't, emotional anesthesia. They could intellectually recognize that situations should evoke emotion, but the emotional response simply didn't come. The study used a clever paradigm where participants watched film clips designed to elicit specific emotions: joy, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. Healthy controls showed predictable emotional and physiological responses. Emotionally numb individuals showed almost no physiological response and reported minimal subjective emotion. But here's what's crucial. When asked what emotion the clip was supposed to evoke, they answered correctly. They understood emotions conceptually. They just couldn't experience them. Brain imaging during this task revealed the mechanism. In emotionally numb individuals, the prefrontal cortex showed high activity during emotional stimuli, while limbic regions showed low activity. The cognitive brain was working overtime to analyze and understand the emotional content, but it wasn't connecting with the emotional brain that generates felt experiences. It's like the wiring between knowing and feeling had been severed. Now, let's talk about the paradox of emotional numbness. Many people initially experience it as relief. After years of overwhelming anxiety, depression, or emotional pain, numbness can feel like peace. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology interviewed individuals in the early stages of emotional numbness. Many described it positively: finally not hurting, a break from the constant emotional roller coaster, feeling stable for the first time. But the researchers followed these individuals longitudinally over 2 years, and the narrative changed dramatically. What initially felt like relief gradually revealed itself as emptiness. Participants described losing not just negative emotions, but positive ones too. They couldn't feel joy at good news, love for important people, excitement about future plans, satisfaction from accomplishments. Life became colorless, meaningless, a series of days to get through rather than experiences to engage with. The study measured quality of life, life satisfaction, and sense of meaning over time. All declined significantly as emotional numbness persisted. The researchers identified what they called the numbness trap. Emotional pain motivates people to seek help and make changes, but numbness removes even that motivation. You're suffering, but you can't feel it enough to be moved to action. You're stuck in a state of existing without living, trapped by the very defense mechanism that was supposed to protect you. Let's examine research on the social consequences of emotional numbness. A 2019 study, published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, found that emotionally numb individuals experienced significant relationship deterioration. Their partners, friends, and family members reported feeling disconnected from them, sensing emotional unavailability, feeling like they were interacting with someone who was physically present but emotionally absent. The researchers used video analysis of social interactions. Emotionally numb individuals showed reduced facial expressiveness, less vocal variation, minimal body language indicating emotional engagement. To outside observers, they appeared flat, disinterested, sometimes even cold, even when they were trying to connect. The emotional signals that facilitate human bonding simply weren't being generated because the underlying emotions weren't being felt. Perhaps most tragically, emotionally numb individuals often desperately wanted connection, but couldn't generate the emotional responses that create it. They could cognitively understand that they loved someone, that they should be happy for someone's success, that they should be sad about someone's loss. But the felt experience that makes these responses authentic was absent. They were emotionally stranded, able to see connection but unable to reach it. Research on what triggers emotional numbness provides important clinical insights. A 2021 study in behavior therapy identified several common pathways. The first was trauma-induced, which we've discussed. The second was medication-induced, particularly from certain antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers. These medications can create emotional blunting as a side effect, where they successfully reduce negative emotions but also flatten positive ones. The third pathway was burnout-induced. Chronic stress, particularly emotional labor in caregiving professions or high-stress jobs, could lead to what researchers called compassion fatigue, that generalized into broad emotional numbing. Healthcare workers, therapists, social workers, and others regularly exposed to others' suffering sometimes developed emotional numbness as a protective adaptation. The brain essentially decided that feeling too much was unsustainable and shut down emotional responsiveness. The fourth pathway was isolation-induced. Prolonged social isolation, particularly during critical developmental periods, led to emotional numbing. The brain's emotional systems need social interaction to remain calibrated and functional. Without regular emotional exchange with others, these systems can atrophy. This became particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. A landmark 2020 study published in JAMA Psychiatry examined mental health effects of pandemic isolation. They found a specific subset of individuals who didn't develop typical depression or anxiety, but instead developed emotional numbness. Brain imaging showed reduced functional connectivity in social cognition networks. Months of limited social interaction had essentially caused use-dependent neural atrophy in circuits that process and generate emotion in social contexts. Let's talk about the neuroplasticity involved in emotional numbness, because understanding that it's an adaptation is crucial to understanding that it can potentially be reversed. Research published in 2021 in Nature Neuroscience examined neuroplasticity in emotional processing networks. They found that emotional numbness, even when chronic, involved functional changes rather than permanent structural damage in most cases. The neural pathways weren't destroyed. They were inhibited, downregulated, made less responsive. The researchers used a treatment protocol involving repeated exposure to emotional stimuli combined with techniques to enhance emotional awareness and expression. Brain imaging before and after the 16-week intervention showed remarkable changes. Limbic activity increased during emotional stimuli. Connectivity between prefrontal and limbic regions strengthened. Neurotransmitter function improved, particularly dopamine and serotonin signaling. The emotional systems, starved of use, began to reactivate when given appropriate stimulation and support. But the success rates revealed something sobering. Only 47% of participants showed significant improvement. The treatment required sustained, uncomfortable effort to re-engage with emotions that the brain had learned to suppress. Many participants dropped out, reporting that the process of feeling again was overwhelming, that they preferred numbness to the intensity of emotions that emerged when the suppression lifted. Research on the specific process of emotional reawakening provides important context for why it's so difficult. A 2020 study published in Clinical Psychological Science tracked individuals recovering from emotional numbness. The researchers found that emotional systems didn't return uniformly. Typically, anxiety and irritability returned first, followed eventually by sadness, and only much later by joy and contentment. This created a devastating experience. People working to overcome numbness initially felt worse, not better. They were feeling again, but what they felt first was pain, fear, and anger. The positive emotions that make feeling worthwhile took longer to return. Many people, experiencing this asymmetric recovery, chose to retreat back into numbness rather than endure what felt like pure negative emotion without corresponding positive emotion to balance it. Let's examine research on the existential aspects of emotional numbness. A 2019 qualitative study published in Existential Analysis interviewed emotionally numb individuals about their sense of meaning and purpose. The findings revealed a profound existential crisis. Without emotions to guide values and preferences, participants struggled to identify what mattered to them, what they wanted, who they were beyond their roles and responsibilities. Emotions aren't just pleasant or unpleasant experiences. They're information systems that tell you what's important. Joy indicates alignment with values. Sadness signals loss of something meaningful. Anger points to boundaries being violated. Fear warns of threats. Without these emotional signals, decision-making became paralyzed. Participants described choosing based purely on logic or others' expectations because they had no emotional compass to guide them toward what they actually cared about. The study found that prolonged emotional numbness led to what researchers called identity erosion. Personality, interests, preferences, values all became nebulous. Who are you when you don't feel anything about anything? The participants described feeling like empty shells, going through life without a sense of self beyond their functional roles. This existential emptiness was, in many ways, more distressing than the emotional pain that preceded the numbness. Research on physical health consequences of emotional numbness reveals that the mind-body connection works both ways. A 2020 study in psychosomatic medicine found that emotional numbness was associated with specific health problems distinct from typical depression. Participants showed higher rates of chronic pain, particularly fibromyalgia and unexplained pain syndromes, fatigue disorders, autoimmune conditions, and cardiovascular issues. The mechanism appears to be that emotions serve important regulatory functions in the body. They help modulate immune function, inflammation, cardiovascular activity, and pain perception. When emotional processing is shut down, these regulatory functions can become dysregulated. The body, no longer receiving appropriate emotional signals, becomes confused in its responses. Pain that should be modulated by emotional context becomes chronic. Immune responses that should be regulated by stress hormones become overactive or underactive. Let's talk about the difference between emotional numbness and alexithymia, because they're often confused but are distinct phenomena. Research published in 2019 in Consciousness and Cognition examined the relationship between these conditions. Alexithymia involves difficulty identifying and describing emotions, but not necessarily reduced emotional intensity. People with alexithymia feel emotions, but can't articulate what they're feeling or understand the emotions. Emotional numbness involves reduced emotional intensity itself. The person can often identify what emotion they should be feeling or what emotion would be appropriate, but the felt experience is absent or dramatically reduced. Brain imaging showed different patterns. Alexithymia involved dysfunction in regions connecting emotional experience with language and conscious awareness. Emotional numbness involved dysfunction in regions generating emotional experience itself. The study found some overlap, where individuals showed both conditions, but they were separable. This matters for treatment because the approaches differ. Alexithymia often responds to interventions improving emotional literacy and interoceptive awareness. Emotional numbness typically requires interventions that reactivate dampened emotional systems, which is considerably more challenging. Research on cultural aspects of emotional numbness provides important context. A 2020 cross-cultural study published in Culture and Brain examined emotional numbing across different societies. They found interesting variations. Cultures with more explicit emotion suppression norms showed higher baseline rates of emotional numbness, suggesting that chronic suppression of emotional expression could eventually lead to suppression of emotional experience itself. However, they also found that cultural context influenced whether emotional numbness was recognized as a problem. In some collectivist cultures, emotional neutrality was valued and seen as maturity or self-control. Individuals who might meet criteria for clinical emotional numbing in Western contexts were functioning well and not distressed in contexts where emotional restraint was normative. The line between adaptive cultural practice and pathological emotional suppression was complex and context-dependent. Now let's examine specific treatments that show promise for emotional numbness. A 2021 meta-analysis in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry reviewed interventions specifically targeting emotional blunting and anhedonia. They found that traditional talk therapy alone showed limited effectiveness. The most promising approaches combined multiple modalities: somatic experiencing to reconnect with body-based emotional cues, behavioral activation to re-engage with potentially rewarding activities, mindfulness to enhance present moment awareness, and, when appropriate, medication adjustments. One particularly innovative approach involved emotional exposure therapy, similar to exposure therapy for anxiety, but focused on gradually re-engaging with emotional experiences. The treatment involved watching films, listening to music, reading literature, engaging in activities specifically designed to evoke emotions, while practicing staying present with whatever emotional response emerged, however minimal. The goal wasn't to force emotions, but to create opportunities for emotional systems to reactivate. Brain imaging studies of this treatment showed promising results. After 20 sessions, participants showed increased limbic activity during emotional stimuli and improved connectivity between cognitive and emotional brain regions. Subjective reports indicated gradual return of emotional capacity, though typically not to pre-numbness levels. Most participants described achieving a muted color emotional life rather than full vibrancy, but even that partial recovery significantly improved quality of life and functioning. Research on psychedelic-assisted therapy for emotional numbness represents an emerging and controversial area. A 2021 study, published in Nature Medicine, examined psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression with prominent emotional blunting. Psilocybin, the active compound in certain mushrooms, temporarily increases neural plasticity and emotional processing. The researchers found that a single psilocybin session, combined with psychological support, led to significant reductions in emotional numbness that persisted for weeks to months. Brain imaging showed that psilocybin temporarily overrode the neural suppression of emotional processing, allowing participants to experience intense emotions during the session. This seemed to reset emotional systems, creating windows where emotional capacity returned. However, the effects were temporary for most participants, requiring repeated sessions. And the treatment wasn't universally positive. Some participants found the sudden return of emotional intensity during the session overwhelming or traumatic, particularly when the emotions that emerged were negative ones that had been suppressed. The approach showed promise, but required careful patient selection and support. For those watching who experience emotional numbness, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're experiencing isn't laziness, apathy, or moral failure. It's a neurological state where your brain's emotional processing systems have been downregulated, likely as a protective response to overwhelming experiences. Your brain essentially decided that not feeling was safer than feeling, and it implemented that decision at a biological level through changes in neural connectivity, neurotransmitter function, and brain activity patterns. But here's what you need to know. Numbness feels safe, but it's not sustainable. Humans need emotions to function fully. We need emotional signals to guide decisions, to form connections, to experience meaning, to regulate our bodies, to know what we care about. Living without emotions isn't peace. It's disconnection from the core of what makes us human. You're not living, you're existing. And while that might feel preferable to pain, long-term it leads to a different kind of suffering, the agony of emptiness. The path back to feeling isn't easy. Your brain has learned to suppress emotions, and relearning to feel requires working against that suppression. It will be uncomfortable. The emotions that return first will likely be difficult ones. Anxiety, sadness, anger, the feelings your brain was trying to protect you from. The positive emotions take longer to return. Many people facing this reality choose to stay numb. But I'm telling you, the difficult emotions are worth it if they're the price of admission to also feeling joy, love, excitement, contentment. You have to decide, do you want to feel, even if it means feeling pain sometimes? Or do you want to continue in this gray existence where nothing touches you, nothing moves you, nothing matters? Because that's the choice. There's no middle ground where you only feel good emotions. The brain doesn't work that way. You either feel or you don't. And not feeling, while initially protective, ultimately becomes its own form of suffering, perhaps more insidious than the pain it was meant to prevent. The science shows recovery is possible, but requires active engagement with the very thing you've been avoiding, emotional experience. It requires therapy that doesn't just talk about feelings, but helps you practice feeling them. It might require medication adjustments if your numbness is medication-induced. It requires lifestyle changes that support emotional regulation, social connection, physical activity, adequate sleep, stress management. It requires patience, because emotional systems don't reactivate overnight. They require consistent stimulation and support to come back online. Most importantly, it requires believing that feeling is worthwhile, even when it's painful. Because if you stay convinced that numbness is preferable to feeling, no treatment will work. You have to want to feel again enough to tolerate the discomfort of reawakening. And that's a choice only you can make. The known suffering of emptiness, or the uncertain journey back to a life where things matter, where you're moved, where you're alive not just biologically, but emotionally and existentially. Emotional numbness isn't the end of the story. It's a chapter, a dark one, but still part of a larger narrative that you're writing whether you realize it or not. The question is whether this chapter continues indefinitely until you die never having felt anything again, or whether this is the chapter where you decide that life without feeling isn't worth living, and you begin the hard work of feeling again. The science says change is possible. Your brain has the capacity to reactivate suppressed systems, but science can't make you want to change. That's something only you can decide.